12 years. 4,380 days of early mornings, late nights, and everything in between. 12 years of building something from nothing. Of turning a struggling marketing agency into Denver's most sought-after brand strategy firm. 12 years of loyalty, dedication, and results that spoke louder than any performance review ever could. And it all came crashing down in a conference room on a Tuesday morning in March, with 3 sentences that would change my life forever. Sarah, we're restructuring the marketing division. Dylan will be taking over your responsibilities effective immediately. We'll need you to clear out your office by the end of the day. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 35, I thought I had seen every kind of workplace politics imaginable. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other. I pulled into the parking garage of Henderson & Co. at 7:30 sharp, the same time I'd arrived for the past 12 years. The Denver skyline was painted in soft pastels as the sun rose over the Rockies, and I remember thinking how beautiful the city looked from the 15th floor. Our office building sat right in the heart of downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered stunning views of both the mountains and the bustling streets below. I grabbed my usual coffee from the lobby, a large vanilla latte with an extra shot, and headed up to the offices that had become my second home. Henderson & Co. occupied 3 full floors of the building, with our marketing department taking up most of the 14th floor. The space was modern and open, with glass-walled conference rooms and collaborative workspaces that I had personally designed during our renovation 5 years ago. As I walked through the marketing department, I felt that familiar surge of pride. This wasn't just a department, it was my legacy. When I started at Henderson & Co. fresh out of college, the marketing team consisted of exactly 2 people, me and an intern who quit after 3 weeks. Bob Henderson had hired me as a junior marketing coordinator for $32,000 a year, and I had been grateful for the opportunity. That was then. Now, our marketing division employed 18 people and generated over 60% of the company's revenue. We had won industry awards, attracted Fortune 500 clients, and established Henderson & Co. as a major player in the competitive Denver marketing landscape. I had personally recruited and trained every single person on my team, and together we had created something extraordinary. Jen Carter, my assistant for the past 4 years, was already at her desk when I arrived. She looked up from her computer with her usual bright smile, though something seemed off about her expression. Jen was 28, fresh-faced, and the most organized person I had ever met. She had started as an intern and worked her way up through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate needs before they arose. "Morning, Sarah," she said, but her voice carried an odd tension. "Bob wants to see you in conference room A at 8:15. I checked my watch. 8:05. Conference room A was the big one, the intimidating space with the massive oak table and the view of the mountains. We used it for major client presentations and important company meetings. It wasn't where Bob typically called people for routine check-in. Did he say what it was about? I asked, setting my coffee down on my desk. Jen shook her head, but I caught her glancing toward the executive floor. He just said to make sure you were there on time. The executive floor. The 16th floor, where Bob Henderson ruled his empire from a corner office that was larger than most people's apartments. I had been up there countless times over the years, usually to present campaign results or discuss major client strategy. Bob had always treated me with respect, even something approaching fatherly affection. He had watched me grow from a nervous college graduate into the senior marketing director who had transformed his company. As I walked toward the elevator, I noticed Dylan Henderson sitting in one of the visitor chairs near the reception desk. Dylan was Bob's only son, 28 years old, with his father's strong jawline but none of his work ethic. He had graduated from business school 6 months ago and had been hanging around the office ever since, supposedly learning the business. In reality, he spent most of his time playing golf with clients and taking credit for work he hadn't done. Dylan looked up as I passed, and something in his expression made my stomach tighten. It was a look of satisfaction, of someone who knew something I did. He was wearing one of his expensive suits, the kind that cost more than most people made in a month, and his perfectly styled hair was swept back in the way that screamed privilege and entitlement. "Morning, Sarah," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Big day ahead." I forced a polite nod and continued to the elevator, but his words echoed in my mind. Big day ahead. What did that mean? The elevator ride to the conference room felt longer than usual. I used the time to mentally review my recent performance. Our biggest client, Tech Forward Solutions, had just renewed their annual contract for another 2 years, thanks to a campaign strategy that had increased their brand recognition by 40%. Mountain Peak Retail was seeing record sales numbers following our holiday marketing blitz. Colorado Springs Bank had specifically requested our team for their upcoming merger announcement campaign. By any objective measure, I was killing it. My team was hitting every target, exceeding every expectation, and bringing in more revenue than ever before. So why did I feel like I was walking into an execution chamber? Conference room A was already occupied when I arrived. Bob Henderson sat at the head of the massive table, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his face wearing the expression he reserved for difficult conversation. To his right sat Rebecca Walsh, our HR director, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses, who always looked like she was calculating the legal implications of every word spoken in her presence. And to Bob's left sat Dylan. That's when I knew the pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Dylan's smug expression in the lobby, Rebecca's presence, the formal setting. This wasn't a performance review or a project discussion. This was something else entirely. "Sarah, please sit down," Bob said, gesturing to the chair across from him. His voice was formal, lacking the warmth that had characterized our working relationship for over a decade. I sat down slowly, my hands folded in my lap, and waited. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the morning rush hour traffic moving through downtown Denver. People heading to their jobs, unaware that my world was about to implode. "Sarah," Bob began, his eyes fixed on a folder in front of him rather than meeting my gaze. "As you know, Henderson & Co. has grown significantly over the past few years. Much of that growth has been in the marketing division." I nodded, unsure where this was heading but sensing it wasn't anywhere good. "With growth comes the need for change, for fresh perspectives, and new approaches to leadership." He finally looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Discomfort, maybe even guilt. "After careful consideration, I've decided to restructure the marketing division." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of client presentations and high-stakes meetings had taught me how to maintain composure even when everything inside me was screaming. "Dylan has completed his MBA with a focus on digital marketing and brand strategy," Bob continued, and I noticed how his son straightened in his chair, practically glowing with anticipation. "He's ready to take on more responsibility within the company, and I believe his fresh perspective is exactly what our marketing division needs." I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to speak calmly. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Dylan will be taking over as senior marketing director, effective immediately. He'll be leading the team and managing all major client relationships." Bob's words were coming faster now, as if he wanted to get through this as quickly as possible. "We're offering you a transition role as marketing coordinator, with a corresponding adjustment to your salary and responsibilities." Marketing coordinator. The same title I had held 12 years ago as a college graduate. The same role I had worked nights and weekends to escape, building my expertise and proving my value one campaign at a time. They were essentially offering to demote me to where I had started, with Dylan, who had never run a campaign in his life, taking over everything I had built. "And if I decline the transition role?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Rebecca Walsh spoke for the first time, her voice crisp and professional. "Then we would have to terminate your employment with the company. We would, of course, provide a generous severance package, in recognition of your years of service." Generous severance package. Corporate speak for "here's some money to make this legally clean and ensure you don't cause problems on your way out." I looked at Dylan, who was trying to suppress a smile and failing. This was his moment of triumph. the culmination of months of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that I was only now beginning to understand. All those golf outings with Bob, all those family dinners where business was undoubtedly discussed, all those casual conversations in the break room where Dylan had subtly undermined my decisions and questioned my strategies. "I see," I said quietly. "And you believe Dylan is ready to manage 18 people, oversee campaigns for Fortune 500 companies, and maintain relationships with clients who have been working exclusively with me for years?" Bob's jaw tightened. "Dylan has excellent credentials and fresh ideas. Sometimes organizations need to embrace change, even when it's difficult." Fresh ideas. I almost laughed. Dylan's idea of innovation was using more hashtags on social media posts. His understanding of brand strategy came from textbooks, not from the trenches of real-world client work where you learned that theory and practice were often completely different things. "What about tech-forward solutions?" I asked. Maria Gonzalez specifically requested that I personally manage their account for the next 2 years. "It's written into their contract." Dylan leaned forward, speaking for the first time since I had entered the room. "I'm confident I can maintain that relationship." Fresh perspective. Like Dad said, sometimes clients don't know what they really need. The arrogance in his voice was breathtaking. Maria Gonzalez was one of the sharpest marketing executives I had ever worked with. She had built Tech Forward Solutions brand from a small startup into a major player in the Denver tech scene, and she didn't suffer fools gladly. The idea that Dylan could waltz in and manage her account was absurd. But as I looked around the room at Bob's uncomfortable determination, at Rebecca's legal calculation, at Dylan's entitled confidence, I realized that facts and logic weren't going to matter here. This decision had already been made, probably weeks or even months ago. This meeting wasn't a discussion, it was a notification. "I'll need some time to consider your offer," I said finally. "Of course," Bob replied, but Rebecca was already sliding a folder across the table toward me. "You'll find all the details in there. We'd appreciate an answer by the end of the day." The end of the day. 12 years of my life, reduced to a 12-hour deadline. I stood up, picked up the folder, and walked toward the door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Reached for the handle. Bob's voice stopped me. "Sarah, I want you to know that this isn't personal. You've done excellent work here, truly excellent. But sometimes business requires difficult decisions." I turned back to face him, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man who had mentored me, who had celebrated my successes and supported me through challenge. But then I looked at Dylan, still sitting there with that satisfied smirk, and I understood the truth. This wasn't about business. This was about family. This was about a father who couldn't see past his love for his son, to recognize that he was about to destroy everything his company had built. This was about nepotism in its purest, most destructive form. "I understand perfectly, Bob," I said. "Business is business." I walked out of conference room A and headed straight for the ladies' room, the only place in the office where I could be alone for a few minutes. My hands were shaking as I gripped the marble countertop and stared at my reflection in the mirror. 12 years. Gone. Just like that. But as I stood there processing the shock and betrayal, something else began to emerge, something that surprised me. Relief. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I had been so focused on building and protecting what I had created at Henderson & Co. that I had stopped dreaming about what else might be possible. I had become comfortable, settled, maybe even a little complacent. Well, comfortable was over. I straightened my shoulders, checked my makeup, and walked back out into the office. Jen looked up expectantly as I approached my desk, and I could see the concern written all over her face. "How did it go?" she whispered. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. "Let's just say it's going to be an interesting day." Over the next few hours, word spread through the office like wildfire. Dylan Henderson was taking over the marketing division. Sarah Mitchell was at. The reactions ranged from shock to anger to fear, as my team realized that their jobs and projects were now in the hands of someone who had never managed anything more complex than his golf schedule. David Park, one of our senior account managers, stopped by my desk around noon. David was 32, brilliant with data analytics, and had been instrumental in developing the client retention strategies that had made our department so successful. He looked around nervously before speaking. "Sarah, is it true? Are you really leaving?" I nodded, keeping my voice low. "Looks that way. This is insane," he said, running his hands through his hair. "Dylan couldn't manage a lemonade stand, let alone our client portfolio. What about the Tech Forward campaign launch next month? What about the Mountain Peak retail strategy? He doesn't know anything about any of it." "He'll figure it out," I said, though we both knew that was unlikely. David shook his head. "Half the team is already talking about updating their resumes. This place is going to fall apart." Maybe, I thought, or maybe something better would rise from the ashes. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of quiet conversations, concerned glances, and the strange surreal feeling of watching your life's work being handed over to someone who didn't understand its value. Dylan spent the day in Bob's office, probably getting briefed on client relationships and campaign strategies that he would never truly comprehend. Around 4 o'clock my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized immediately. Maria Gonzalez from Tech Forward Solutions. "Sarah Mitchell," I answered, wondering if the news had already reached our biggest client. "Sarah, it's Maria. I just heard the most ridiculous rumor, and I'm hoping you can set me straight." I took a deep breath. "What did you hear?" "Someone told me that Bob Henderson is replacing you with his son. Please tell me that's not true." The concern in Maria's voice was genuine. Over the past 4 years, we had developed not just a professional relationship, but a mutual respect that went far beyond typical client-vendor dynamic. Maria was tough, demanding, and absolutely brilliant, and she had trusted me with Tech Forward's most important marketing initiatives. "I'm afraid it's true, Maria. Dylan will be taking over all client relationships starting tomorrow." There was a long pause. Dylan Henderson, the kid who spent our last strategy meeting checking his phone and suggesting we make our logo bigger. I couldn't help but smile. "That's the one." "This is unacceptable, Sarah. Completely unacceptable. You've been integral to our success. The campaign you developed for our product launch last year exceeded every target we set. Our brand recognition has increased by 40% since we started working with you, and now Bob thinks he can just hand our account over to his unqualified son." "Maria, I appreciate your support, but..." "No," she interrupted. "This isn't just about support. This is about business. Tech Forward Solutions has built its reputation on working with the best partners, not on enabling corporate nepotism." Before I could respond, Maria continued, "I'm going to call Bob Henderson right now and make it very clear that if you're not managing our account, we'll be taking our business elsewhere." My heart jumped. Tech Forward was Henderson & Co.'s biggest client, representing nearly 30% of the company's total revenue. If they walked away, it would be devastating. "Maria, wait," I said. "I don't want you to make any rash decisions because of what's happening to me." "This isn't rash, Sarah. This is business. And good business means working with people who understand your industry, your challenges, and your goals." Dylan Henderson understands none of those things. After Maria hung up, I sat back in my chair and tried to process what had just happened. In the span of 8 hours, I had gone from being fired to potentially being the cause of Henderson & Co. losing their most important client. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Hey Sarah, heard about the situation at Henderson, would love to chat if you're interested. Coffee tomorrow. James Morrison, Morrison Creative Group." Morrison Creative Group, one of Denver's fastest-growing marketing agencies and Henderson & Co.'s biggest competitor. James Morrison was known for poaching top talent and building dynamic teams that consistently outperformed the established firms. Then another text, this one from a former colleague who had left Henderson 2 years ago. "Sarah, heard the news, ridiculous decision by Bob. Call me when you get a chance, I have some ideas." And another, Can't believe what happened. You're the best in the business. Let's grab lunch and talk opportunity. Word was spreading fast in Denver's tight-knit marketing community, and the response was unanimous. Bob Henderson had made a massive mistake. As 5 o'clock approached, I made my decision. I walked up to the 16th floor and knocked on Bob's office door. "Come in," he called. Bob was alone, sitting behind his massive mahogany desk with papers scattered across the surface. He looked tired, older than his 58 years, and for a moment, I felt sorry for him. Running a company was never easy, and trying to balance family obligations with business decisions had to be incredibly difficult. "I've made my decision about the transition role," I said, sitting down across from him. He looked up hopefully. "And, I'm declining. I'll be accepting the severance package and leaving Henderson and Co." Bob's face fell. "Sarah, I really hope you'll reconsider. Dylan could benefit enormously from your guidance and experience." "Bob, with all due respect, Dylan doesn't want my guidance. He wants my job, my team, and my clients, but he doesn't want to put in the work to earn them." "That's not fair," Bob said, but his voice lacked conviction. "What's not fair is promoting someone based on their last name, rather than their qualification. What's not fair is taking a department that generates 60% of your revenue and handing it over to someone who has never managed a team or developed a successful campaign." Bob was quiet for a long moment. "Dylan is my son, Sarah. Sometimes we have to make decisions that balance business needs with family obligations." "I understand that," I said, "but I don't have to be part of it." As I stood to leave, Bob's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and winced. "Sarah, could you wait just a moment? I need to take this." He answered the phone, and I could hear Maria Gonzalez's voice, even from across the room. She was not happy. "Bob, I'm calling to inform you that Tech Forward Solutions will be terminating our contract with Henderson and Co. Effective immediately." Bob's face went pale. "Maria, let's not make any hasty decisions. I'm sure we can work through whatever concerns you might have." "My concerns are simple." Maria's voice came through clearly. "Sarah Mitchell has been instrumental in our marketing success, and replacing her with your inexperienced son is unacceptable. We've already begun the process of finding new representation." "Maria, please. Dylan has excellent credentials and fresh ideas." "Bob, I've met Dylan. He spent our last meeting suggesting we change our company colors to something more fun, and asked if we had considered using more emoji in our corporate communications." "That's not fresh thinking. That's amateur hour." I watched Bob's face crumble as he realized the full implications of his decision. Losing Tech Forward wouldn't just hurt the bottom line, it would send a message to every other client that Henderson and Co. was no longer the professional, results-driven agency they had built their reputation on. "If you're determined to make this change," Maria continued, "then Tech Forward will be taking our business elsewhere. And Sarah, if you're listening, call me tomorrow. I have a proposition for you." The line went dead, and Bob sat in stunned silence for a moment before looking up at me. "Did you put her up to this?" he asked. "No," I said honestly, "but I'm not surprised. Maria values results over relationships, and she knows Dylan can't deliver what she needs." Bob rubbed his temples. "One client. Sarah, we can survive losing one client." But we both knew it wouldn't be just one client. In the marketing world, reputation was everything, and word would spread quickly that Henderson and Co. was prioritizing nepotism over competence. Other clients would start questioning their relationships with the agents. Competitors would start circling like sharks. "I hope you're right," I said. "Good luck, Bob. You're going to need it." I walked out of his office for the last time, knowing that my 12-year chapter at Henderson and Co. was officially closed. But as I rode the elevator down to my floor to pack up my belongings, I felt something I hadn't expected: excitement. For the first time in years, I had no idea what came next, and that terrifying uncertainty felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. The next morning arrived with an unusual quiet in the Henderson and Co. offices. I came in early, as was my habit, knowing I had exactly 8 hours to clean out 12 years of my professional life. The security badge that had granted me access to every floor, every conference room, every corner of this building would be deactivated by close of business. After today, I would be just another visitor requiring an escort. Dylan Henderson arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, strutting through the marketing department like a peacock displaying his plumage. He wore a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most of our junior employees made in a month, and his confidence radiated from every pore. This was his moment, the culmination of months of careful manipulation and family pressure that had finally paid off. He made a show of walking slowly through the department, stopping at each workstation to introduce himself as the new senior marketing director. I watched from my office as my team members looked up with forced smiles and polite nods, their discomfort obvious to anyone who knew them well. These were people I had hired, trained, and mentored. They knew exactly what Dylan's appointment meant for their careers and the future of the department. At precisely 9:15, Dylan knocked on my office doorframe. He didn't wait for permission to enter, simply walked in and settled himself in the chair across from my desk as if he already owned the space. "So, Sarah," he said, leaning back with his hands clasped behind his head, "I thought we should talk about the transition process, make sure everything goes smoothly." I continued packing files into boxes, not bothering to look up. "What would you like to know?" "Well, for starters, I'll need all your client contact information, campaign histories, strategy documents, and performance reports. Dad says you've been pretty secretive about your methods, but that's going to change under my leadership." Secretive. The word hit me like a slap. For 12 years I had documented every campaign, shared every strategy, and trained anyone who showed genuine interest in learning. The only thing I had been secretive about was my growing suspicion that Dylan was positioning himself to take over, but apparently, that hadn't been much of a secret either. "Everything is documented in our project management system," I said calmly. "Your father can give you administrative access." Dylan shifted in his chair, clearly disappointed that I wasn't more flustered by his presence. "I've also been thinking about some changes to the team structure. Fresh blood, you know, some of these people have gotten a little too comfortable." The threat was barely veiled. Dylan wasn't just taking over my position, he was planning to remake the entire department in his image. The team I had carefully assembled over years of recruitment and development would be scattered to make room for his own people, probably friends from business school who were equally unqualified but shared his sense of entitlement. "That's your decision to make," I replied, though each word tasted bitter. "I'm glad you understand," Dylan said, standing up and smoothing his tie. "Oh, and Sarah, I hope there won't be any hard feelings about this. Business is business, right? Business is business." The same phrase his father had used yesterday, delivered with the same casual dismissal of 12 years of dedication. It was becoming the Henderson family motto, a convenient way to justify decisions that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with preserving their dynasty. After Dylan left my office, Jen appeared in the doorway with tears in her eyes. She had been crying on and off since yesterday's announcement, and I could see the strain on her face. Jen had worked her way up from intern to my trusted assistant, and now she faced the prospect of working for someone who saw her as nothing more than office furniture. "Sarah, this is so wrong," she whispered, closing the door behind her. "Everyone knows Dylan can't do this job. The whole department is talking about leaving." I set down the frame I was packing and looked at her seriously. "Jen, listen to me carefully. Don't do anything rash. Don't quit, don't make any statements, and don't give Dylan any excuse to let you go. You're good at what you do, and you'll land on your feet wherever you end up. But what about you? What are you going to do?" That was the question I had been avoiding all morning. What was I going to do? For the first time in 12 years I had no plan, no strategy, no clear path forward. The uncertainty was both terrifying and oddly liberating. "I'm going to figure it out," I said, "and when I do, I'll let you know." Around 10:30 David Park knocked on my door. He looked around nervously before entering, clearly not wanting to be seen having a private conversation with the soon-to-be former senior marketing director. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," he said, lowering his voice. "Yesterday, after the announcement, Dylan called a meeting with some of the senior staff. He basically said that anyone who had a problem with the new leadership structure should consider whether Henderson & Co. is the right fit for them." The message was clear:
Get on board or get out. Dylan was moving quickly to consolidate power and eliminate anyone who might question his authority or compare his performance to mine. He also said, David continued, that the department had become too focused on long-term relationships and not enough on immediate results. He wants to implement what he called aggressive growth strategies to show quick wins. I felt my stomach tighten. Aggressive growth strategies usually meant cutting corners, making promises you couldn't keep, and prioritizing short-term revenue over sustainable client relationships. It was exactly the kind of thinking that destroyed agencies and burned bridges with clients who had taken years to develop. David, whatever you do, don't let him pressure you into anything that compromises your professional integrity, I said. Your reputation is the only thing that truly belongs to you in this industry.
Before David could respond, Dylan's voice echoed through the department, calling everyone to gather in the main conference room for an all-hands meeting. I watched through my office window as my former team reluctantly filed into the space where we had celebrated campaign successes, brainstormed creative solutions, and built the culture that had made our department the most successful in the company. 20 minutes later, they emerged, looking shell-shocked. Jen stopped by my office to fill me in on Dylan's inaugural address to the troops. He said the department had gotten complacent under the previous leadership, she reported, her voice tight with anger. He talked about implementing disruptive innovations and maximizing synergistic opportunities. Half the people in there didn't even know what he was talking about. I could picture the scene perfectly. Dylan standing at the head of the conference table, throwing around business school buzzwords and corporate speak to mask the fact that he had no real understanding of what the department actually did. My team, seasoned professionals who had worked in the trenches of client service and campaign development, listening politely while internally rolling their eyes at the amateur who was now their boss. He also announced that he's bringing in a consultant to evaluate everyone's performance and identify areas for improvement, Jen continued. Some guy named Brett Morrison from Morrison Creative Group. My blood ran cold. Brett Morrison was James Morrison's younger brother, known in the industry for his ruthless efficiency evaluations that usually resulted in massive layoffs. Bringing him in wasn't about improvement, it was about building a case to fire anyone Dylan saw as a threat or obstacle to his vision. But there was something else about the Morrison connection that worried me. James Morrison had texted me yesterday about coffee, which meant he was already circling like a vulture, ready to pick up the pieces when Henderson and Co. inevitably imploded. Having his brother conduct the performance evaluations was a brilliant move that would give Morrison Creative Group inside information about Henderson's best people before they hit the job market. Around noon, I received a visitor I hadn't expected. Rebecca Walsh from HR knocked on my office door, looking more uncomfortable than I had ever seen her. Rebecca was usually the picture of corporate composure, but today she seemed nervous, almost fidgety. Sarah, I wanted to speak with you privately before you leave, she said, closing the door behind her. Of course. What's on your mind? Rebecca sat down and fidgeted with her pen for a moment before speaking. I need you to know that I advised against this decision. I told Bob that promoting Dylan without proper experience or transitional training was a mistake. This was the first time Rebecca had ever shared her professional opinion with me about a management decision. HR directors usually maintained strict neutrality, but apparently, even she couldn't stomach what was happening. I appreciate that, Rebecca. What did Bob say? He said family considerations outweighed professional concern, that Dylan needed an opportunity to prove himself, and that you were strong enough to handle the transition gracefully. Handle the transition gracefully. Translation: Bob expected me to smile, accept my demotion or termination, and help train my replacement without complaint. He expected me to prioritize his family dynamics over my own career and the well-being of the team I had built. Rebecca, can I ask you something off the record? I said. She nodded, though she looked nervous about what I might ask. How many of the senior staff do you think will actually stay and work under Dylan? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her words carefully. Honestly, I think we're going to see a significant exodus over the next few months. People don't just leave jobs, Sarah, they leave managers, and Dylan, well, He doesn't have the experience or temperament to lead a team of professionals. What about the clients? That's what keeps me up at night, Rebecca admitted. Our client relationships are built on trust and expertise. When word gets out that we've replaced our senior marketing director with someone who has never managed a major campaign, I think we'll see defections there too. As if on cue, my phone rang. The caller ID showed another client number, Michael Chen from Mountain Peak Retail, our second largest account. I should take this, I told Rebecca, who nodded and quietly left my office. Sarah Mitchell, I answered. Sarah, it's Mike. I just heard some disturbing news about changes at Henderson & Co. Please tell me it's not true that you're being replaced by Bob's son. The concern in Michael's voice was genuine. Mountain Peak Retail had been hemorrhaging market share to online competitors when they first came to us 2 years ago. The integrated campaign strategy I had developed for them had not only stopped the bleeding, but actually increased their revenue by 20%. Michael knew exactly who was responsible for that turnaround. I'm afraid it's true, Michael. Dylan Henderson will be taking over all client relationships starting tomorrow. This is ridiculous, Michael said bluntly. I've met Dylan at a few industry events. Nice enough kid, but he couldn't strategy his way out of a paper bag. What is Bob thinking? I think Bob believes Dylan deserves a chance to prove himself, I said diplomatically. At the expense of proven performance? Sarah, you've saved our company. The holiday campaign alone generated more traffic than we've seen in 5 years, and now Bob wants to hand that relationship over to someone who thinks brand strategy means picking the right filter for Instagram posts. Before I could respond, Michael continued. I'm going to call Bob right now and make it clear that Mountain Peak expects continuity in our account management. If Dylan is taking over, we'll need to reconsider our relationship with Henderson & Co. After Michael hung up, I sat back in my chair and tried to process what was happening. In less than 24 hours, I had gone from being an integral part of Henderson & Co. success to being the catalyst for its potential downfall. Major clients were threatening to leave not because of anything I had done, but because of my absence and what it represented about the company's priorities. My computer chimed with an email notification. The message was from Maria Gonzalez at Tech Forward Solutions, and the subject line made my heart skip. Opportunity discussion. I opened the email to find a brief but intriguing message. Sarah, as discussed yesterday, Tech Forward is terminating our relationship with Henderson & Co. We'd like to discuss an exclusive consulting arrangement with you personally. Are you available for lunch today? My treat. Maria. Exclusive consulting arrangement. The phrase carried enormous implication. Tech Forward wasn't just looking for a new agency. They were considering bringing their marketing strategy in-house by hiring me directly. It would mean working as an independent consultant rather than an agency employee, with all the freedom and risk that entailed. I was still processing Maria's email when Dylan appeared in my doorway again, this time looking less confident than he had that morning. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his perfectly styled hair showed signs of stress-induced finger comb. Sarah, we need to talk, he said, closing the door behind him. Dad just got off the phone with Michael Chen at Mountain Peak, and apparently there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Dylan's way of saying that a major client had just threatened to leave because of his appointment. What kind of misunderstanding? I asked innocently. Michael seems to think that you're irreplaceable, that the company can't maintain his account without you. Obviously that's not true. Any qualified marketing professional can manage client relationships. The irony was rich. Dylan, who had never managed any client relationship, was lecturing me about how easy it was to maintain accounts that had taken years to develop and nurture. What would you like me to do about it? I asked. I need you to call Michael and reassure him that the transition will be smooth. Explain that you're confident in my abilities and that Mountain Peak is in good hands. I stared at Dylan for a long moment, wondering if he truly believed I would help him clean up the mess his appointment had created. Did he really think I would spend my last day at Henderson & Co., vouching for his competence and helping him secure the clients I had worked so hard to win? Dylan, I'm not going to lie to a client about your experience or qualifications. If Michael has concerns about the transition, you'll need to address them yourself. Dylan's face flushed red, and for a moment, I saw past his confident facade to the insecure young man underneath. "You're sabotaging me," he said. "You're turning my clients against me before I even have a chance to prove myself." My clients. He had already started thinking of them as his, despite never having worked on their accounts or even understanding their business challenge. "Dylan, I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm simply not going to compromise my professional integrity to make your transition easier. These clients have legitimate concerns about continuity and expertise. If you want to address those concerns, you'll need to do it with performance, not with my endorsement." Dylan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Fine, but don't expect any references from Henderson and Co. when you're looking for your next job. Dad won't be happy to hear that you refuse to help with the transition." After he left, I sat in the quiet of my office and realized something important. I wasn't angry. The rage and betrayal I had felt yesterday had crystallized into something much more powerful. Clarity. For months, maybe even years, I had been so focused on protecting what I had built at Henderson and Co. that I had stopped growing. I had become comfortable in my role, satisfied with my achievements, and perhaps a little too dependent on Bob Henderson's approval. The security of a steady paycheck and established relationships had made me risk-averse, content to manage and maintain rather than innovate and expand. Dylan's appointment, as devastating as it felt, had forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I had been playing it safe for too long. I had been so busy being the perfect employee that I had forgotten what it felt like to take real risks and chase bigger opportunities. My phone buzzed with a text message from James Morrison. "Heard about the tech forward situation. Impressive how quickly words spread. Coffee offer still stands if you're interested in discussing the future rather than dwelling on the past. The future rather than the past." James Morrison was many things, but subtle wasn't one of them. He was clearly positioning himself and Morrison Creative Group as the beneficiary of Henderson and Co. self-inflicted wounds. But his message also contained an important reminder. This wasn't the end of my career. It was the beginning of something new. I picked up my phone and replied to Maria Gonzalez's email. "Lunch sounds perfect. How about Romano's at 1 o'clock? I have a feeling this conversation will be very interesting." Then I sent a second email to James Morrison. "Coffee tomorrow morning. I'm suddenly very interested in discussing the future." As I continued packing my belongings, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. For the first time since college, I had no idea what came next. The safety net of Henderson and Co. was gone, but so were the constraints that had kept me from taking bigger risks and pursuing grander ambitions. Dylan Henderson thought he had won by taking my job, my team, and my office. What he didn't realize was that he had actually set me free. The Henderson and Co. offices felt different that afternoon, charged with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to ripple through every conversation and corridor. Word had spread beyond the marketing department about the dramatic changes in leadership, and the reactions ranged from confusion to outright disbelief. This wasn't just about one department reorganization anymore. It was about the fundamental direction and values of the entire company. I spent most of the afternoon methodically packing 12 years of professional memories into cardboard boxes. Awards from industry associations, photos from client events, the coffee mug that read "World's Best Marketing Director" that my team had given me last Christmas. Each item represented not just personal achievement, but relationships built, challenges overcome, and trust earned through years of consistent performance. The most difficult items to pack were the thank you notes from clients, handwritten letters expressing gratitude for successful campaigns and strategic guidance that had transformed their businesses. Maria Gonzalez had sent me a beautiful card after our product launch campaign exceeded all targets. "Sarah, your strategic vision and creative execution didn't just meet our goals, they redefined what we thought was possible. Thank you for being a true partner." Michael Chen had written something similar after the holiday campaign. "You didn't just save our retail strategy, you saved our company. We couldn't have done this without your expertise and dedication." These weren't just professional courtesies, they were testimonials to the real value I had created, the tangible difference my work had made in these companies' success. As I carefully placed each note in my memory box, I realized that Dylan might be inheriting my office and my title, but he could never inherit the trust and respect that these relationships represented. Around 2 o'clock I noticed a commotion near the reception area. Voices were raised, and there seemed to be some kind of heated discussion taking place. Through my office window I could see Bob Henderson standing with a man I didn't recognize, both of them gesturing animatedly. Bob's face was flushed and his usually composed demeanor had cracked to reveal genuine distress. Jen appeared at my door, her eyes wide with excitement and concern. "Sarah, you're not going to believe what's happening. That's Richard Martinez from the Denver Business Journal out there, and he's asking questions about the management changes. Apparently someone tipped him off about what's happening here." The Denver Business Journal was the most influential business publication in the region, widely read by executives, investors and decision-makers throughout the Colorado market. A critical article about Henderson and Co.'s leadership decisions could damage the company's reputation far beyond the immediate impact of losing a few clients. "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "He's asking about nepotism, about whether Dylan is qualified for the position, about how clients are reacting to the changes. Rebecca Walsh is freaking out and Dylan is nowhere to be found." I continued packing while listening to the muffled conversations drifting from the reception area. Bob's voice carried the tone of a man trying to control a narrative that was rapidly spinning beyond his influence. This was exactly the kind of public scrutiny that companies tried to avoid, the type of negative attention that could take years to overcome. 20 minutes later, David Park knocked on my door again, this time with information that made my heart sink and soar simultaneously. "Sarah, I just overheard a conference call between Bob and the senior partner. 3 more clients called this morning expressing concerns about the management transition. Colorado Springs Bank wants to schedule a meeting to discuss the continuity of their account management, and Southwest Tech Solutions is asking to speak directly with you about their upcoming campaign." The dominoes were falling faster than anyone had anticipated. What Bob had presumably envisioned as a smooth internal transition was becoming a very public crisis of confidence. Each client call was essentially a vote of no confidence in Dylan's ability to maintain the relationships and deliver the results they had come to expect. "There's more," David continued, lowering his voice. "I heard Bob on the phone with the bank and he was basically begging them not to make any hasty decisions. He offered to personally guarantee the quality of service, and promised that Dylan would be working closely with experienced team members. Personal guarantees and promises of supervision. In other words, Bob was already recognizing that Dylan couldn't handle these relationships independently, despite having just promoted him to a position that required exactly that capability. My computer chimed again with another email, this one from Jennifer Walsh in our PR department. "Sarah, I'm getting calls from industry publications asking about the management changes. How would you like me to handle these inquiries?" Industry publication. The story was spreading beyond the local business community into the broader marketing and advertising world. In an industry where reputation was everything, this kind of negative attention could follow Henderson and Co. for years. I replied to Jennifer's email, "Please direct all inquiries to Bob Henderson or Rebecca Walsh. I won't be making any public statements about internal company decisions." It was the diplomatic response, the professional approach that maintained my integrity, while avoiding any appearance of deliberately damaging my former employer. But I knew that my silence would speak as loudly as any statement I could make. People in the industry would draw their own conclusions about a senior marketing director who was replaced by an unqualified family member, and chose not to defend the decision publicly. Around 3 o'clock, the atmosphere in the office shifted again. I heard rapid footsteps in the hallway, hushed urgent conversations, and the unmistakable sound of crisis management in action. Through my window I could see small groups of employees clustered together, their body language suggesting they were discussing something significant. The source of the new tension became clear when Jen burst into my office, with barely controlled excitement. "Sarah, you have to see this. Morrison Creative Group just announced on LinkedIn that they're expanding their client services team and actively recruiting experienced marketing professionals." James Morrison posted about exciting opportunities for talented individuals who want to work in an environment that values merit over politics. Merit over politics. The message was unmistakable,
and the timing was perfect. James Morrison was essentially announcing to the entire Denver marketing community that Henderson and Co.'s decision to promote Dylan was a political move rather than a merit-based one, and that Morrison Creative Group was ready to welcome anyone who wanted to work in a more professional environment. But the LinkedIn post was just the beginning. Over the next hour, I watched as other agencies and companies began posting their own recruitment messages, each one carefully worded to attract talent from Henderson and Co. Without directly criticizing the company, the industry was circling like sharks, sensing opportunity in the chaos. My phone rang again, this time showing a number I didn't recognize. Sarah Mitchell, I answered. Ms. Mitchell, this is Karen Rodriguez from the Colorado Marketing Association. I'm calling to follow up on your application for the keynote speaker position at our annual conference. The Colorado Marketing Association Conference was the premier industry event in the region, attended by hundreds of marketing professionals and business leaders. I had applied to be a keynote speaker months ago, proposing a presentation about building sustainable client relationships in a competitive market. I'm glad you called, Karen. Has the committee made a decision about the keynote positions? Actually, yeah. We'd like to offer you the opening keynote slot for the main conference day. Your proposal about relationship building really resonated with our board, especially given your track record at Henderson and Co. Track record at Henderson and Co. Past tense. Word was definitely spreading throughout the industry about my departure, and apparently it was working in my favor rather than against me. I'm honored by the offer, Karen. I should mention that I'm no longer with Henderson and Co. as of today. Would that affect the committee's decision? There was a brief pause. Actually, Ms. Mitchell, that makes your perspective even more valuable. The conference theme this year is navigating industry transitions, and your experience would provide exactly the kind of real-world insight our attendees are looking for. After accepting the keynote position, I sat back in my chair and tried to process the day's events. In less than 24 hours, I had gone from being an unemployed former marketing director to being in demand as a speaker, consultant, and potential hire. The industry was clearly interpreting my departure from Henderson and Co. as their loss and everyone else's gain. Around 4 o'clock, Dylan made his third appearance in my office, and this time his confidence had completely evaporated. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his face showed the strain of a very difficult day. He closed the door behind him and sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. "Sarah, I need your help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't going the way Dad and I expected." The transformation was remarkable. The arrogant young executive who had strutted through the department that morning had been replaced by a confused and overwhelmed kid who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had stepped into. "What specifically do you need help with, Dylan?" "Everything," he said, running his hands through his hair. "I spent 2 hours on the phone with Maria Gonzalez, and she basically told me that Tech Forward has already signed with a new agency. Colorado Springs Bank wants to meet next week, but I don't even know what their current campaign objectives are, and Mountain Peak is threatening to review their entire relationship with us." I felt a moment of genuine sympathy for Dylan. Yes, he had manipulated his way into a position he wasn't qualified for, but he was also a young man who had been set up for failure by a father who couldn't separate family loyalty from business judgment. "Dylan, those relationships took years to build. Each client has specific needs, preferences, and expectations that were developed through consistent interaction and proven results. You can't just step into those relationships and expect them to transfer automatically." "But Dad said you'd help with the transition. He said you'd make sure everything went smoothly," your dad said. Even now, facing the collapse of everything he thought he wanted, Dylan was still relying on his father's authority rather than taking responsibility for his own action. "Dylan, I'm not going to lie to clients about your experience or capabilities, but I can give you some advice that might help you moving forward." He looked up hopefully. "What kind of advice?" "Stop trying to be me," I said bluntly. "Stop trying to step into relationships and campaigns that you don't understand. Instead, focus on learning the business from the ground up. Start with smaller accounts, work closely with experienced team members, and build your own track record gradually." Dylan's face fell. "But Dad expects immediate results. He wants me to prove that I can handle the major accounts." Then your dad has set you up for failure, I said honestly. No one becomes a senior marketing director overnight regardless of their family connection. The skills required for this position take years to develop. For a moment, Dylan looked like he might cry. The weight of unrealistic expectations, public scrutiny, and professional failure was clearly overwhelming him. I realized that he was as much a victim of Bob's poor judgment as I was, just in a different way. What am I supposed to do? He asked. You have two choices, I said. You can either acknowledge that you're not ready for this position and ask your father to create a more appropriate role for you, or you can commit to doing whatever it takes to actually learn the job, even if it means starting over at a lower level. Dad will never agree to either of those options. He's already announced the promotion to everyone. His reputation is tied to my success now, and there was the heart of the problem. Bob Henderson had made a decision based on family dynamics rather than business needs, and now both he and Dylan were trapped by the public nature of that choice. Admitting that Dylan wasn't qualified would be admitting that Bob had made a fundamental error in judgment. After Dylan left my office, I finished packing my belongings and prepared for my final walk through the Henderson & Co. offices. As I carried my boxes toward the elevator, I noticed that the usual afternoon energy had been replaced by an atmosphere of uncertainty and concern. People spoke in hushed tones, glanced nervously toward the executive floor, and seemed to be bracing for more bad news. At the elevator, I encountered Rebecca Walsh, who was carrying a stack of resignation letters. How many? I asked quietly. 4. So far today, she replied. 3 from the marketing department, and 1 from account services. I expect more tomorrow, when word spreads about the client defections. What's Bob saying about all this? Rebecca sighed. He's in denial. He keeps insisting that it's just temporary resistance to change, that people will adjust once they see Dylan's potential, but the board is starting to ask questions. Bob Henderson owned a majority stake in the company, but he still had investors and partners who expected reasonable business decisions. If the client defections continued and the negative publicity grew, even Bob's position might become vulnerable. As the elevator descended to the parking garage, I reflected on the strange turn my life had taken in just 2 days. I had walked into this building Tuesday morning as a successful senior marketing director, with a secure position and a bright future. I was leaving Thursday afternoon as an unemployed consultant with nothing but a severance package and a box of memories, but I was also leaving with something Dylan would never have: the respect and trust of clients who had seen my work and understood my value. I was leaving with a reputation built on performance rather than family connections, and I was leaving with the knowledge that sometimes the best thing that can happen to your career is being forced to start over. That evening I sat in my downtown Denver apartment, surrounded by boxes from my former office, and trying to process the whirlwind of the past 2 days. The apartment was a reflection of my personality: clean lines, modern furniture, and large windows that offered spectacular views of the Rocky Mountains. It was a space I had carefully curated over the years, a sanctuary that represented stability and success in a demanding career. Now, as I looked around at the evidence of my professional life scattered across the coffee table and kitchen counter, I felt an unexpected sense of liberation. For the first time in 12 years, I had no meetings scheduled for tomorrow, no client deadlines looming, no team members depending on my guidance. The absence of structure and responsibility was both terrifying and oddly peaceful. I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my laptop to review the emails that had accumulated throughout the day. The messages painted a clear picture of an industry in flux, with Henderson & Co. at the center of a storm that was growing stronger by the hour. The first email was from Sandra Kim, a former colleague who had left Henderson & Co. 3 years earlier to start her own consulting firm. Her message was brief but pointed. Sarah, heard about the situation at Henderson. If you're interested in freelance work while you figure out your next move, I have more clients than I can handle. Let's talk. The second was from Robert Chen, Michael's brother and the CMO of a major Denver-based software company. Sarah, Michael spoke very highly of your work with Mountain Peak. We're looking for strategic marketing guidance for our Q3 product launch. Are you available for consulting work? Email after email followed the same pattern: former clients, industry contacts, and business leaders reaching out with opportunities. advice and support. It was becoming clear that my departure from Henderson and Co. was being viewed not as a career setback, but as an opportunity for others to access expertise that had previously been locked up in an exclusive agency relationship. One email stood out from the rest.
It was from Patricia Williams, the CEO of Williams & Associates, one of Denver's most prestigious executive search firms. Sarah, I hope this message finds you well during what I imagine is a challenging transition. Your reputation in the Denver marketing community is exemplary, and I wanted to reach out to discuss some executive-level opportunities that might be of interest. Several of my clients have specifically mentioned your name when discussing their marketing leadership needs. Would you be available for a confidential conversation next week? Best regards, Patricia. Executive-level opportunities. Multiple clients mentioning my name specifically. The implication was clear. While Dylan Henderson was struggling to maintain the relationships I had built, the broader market was recognizing my value and actively seeking ways to benefit from my availability. I set my laptop aside and walked to the large windows that dominated my living room. The city sprawled below me, lights beginning to twinkle as the sun set behind the mountains. Somewhere out there, Dylan was probably having dinner with his father, discussing damage control strategies and trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding. Bob Henderson was likely realizing that his decision to promote his son was turning into the biggest crisis of his 20-year business career. But what they probably didn't realize was that the crisis was just beginning. I had spent 12 years building not just client relationships, but an entire network of industry contacts, strategic partnerships, and professional alliances. Every person who had worked with me, learned from me, or benefited from my expertise was now watching to see what would happen next. My phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Gonzalez. Sarah, thanks for lunch today. The consulting proposal looks perfect. Can we schedule a call tomorrow to discuss implementation timeline? Also, I may have mentioned your availability to a few other CEO friends. Hope that's okay. Maria Lunch with Maria had been a revelation. What started as a discussion about Tech Forward's immediate marketing needs had evolved into a comprehensive consulting arrangement that would give me creative freedom and financial security while building my independent practice. But more importantly, Maria had offered to introduce me to other executives who were looking for high-level marketing strategy guidance. The consulting arrangement was structured beautifully. Rather than simply hiring me to replace Henderson, and Tech Forward wanted me to develop a completely new approach to their market positioning, one that leveraged my expertise while building their internal marketing capability. It was challenging, creative work that would showcase my abilities to a broader audience, while generating the kind of results that would attract other high-profile clients. Another text arrived, this one from James Morrison. Sarah, great conversation this morning. The offer stands whenever you're ready to discuss it. No pressure, but Morrison Creative Group could use someone with your client development skills. Think about it. The conversation with James had been interesting but ultimately unsatisfying. Morrison Creative Group was successful and growing, but it would still mean working for someone else, following someone else's vision, and building someone else's business. After experiencing the freedom of potential independence, the idea of joining another agency felt like a step backward rather than forward. I opened my laptop again and began drafting a response to Patricia Williams. Her offer to discuss executive opportunities was intriguing, but I wanted to be strategic about any conversations. The morning alarm felt different when it went off at 6:30. For the first time in 12 years, I wasn't rushing to get ready for Henderson and Co. Instead, I had the luxury of a slow morning routine, time to process the events of the past few days, and space to think strategically about what had really been happening behind the scenes. As I made coffee in my kitchen, overlooking the Denver skyline painted in soft morning light, my mind began connecting dots I hadn't noticed while I was in the middle of the storm. The signs had been there for months, subtle but consistent, like a pattern emerging from seemingly random events. It started with the small changes I had noticed in late fall, around the time Dylan had finished his MBA program and began spending more time at the office. Client meetings that had been scheduled for months were suddenly being rescheduled or moved to conference rooms, where Dylan happened to be present. Strategic planning sessions that I typically led were being restructured to include his input, despite his lack of relevant experience. I remembered the first time I had felt something was off. It was during the October all-hands meeting where Bob Henderson had announced the company's record-breaking third-quarter results. I had presented the marketing department's contributions, highlighting the successful campaigns that had driven much of that growth. After my presentation, Bob had made a comment that seemed innocent at the time but now felt loaded with significance. Of course, we couldn't have achieved these results without fresh perspectives and innovative thinking, he had said, glancing meaningfully at Dylan. The next generation brings energy and ideas that complement our experienced team's execution capabilities. Fresh perspective, innovative thinking. The next generation, language that subtly positioned Dylan as the source of innovation, while reducing my role to mere execution. At the time, I had dismissed it as a father's natural pride in his son's education and potential. Now I realized it was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated narrative shift. The pattern became clearer as I remembered other incidents. In November, Dylan had started attending client dinners that had previously been my responsibility. Bob introduced him as our rising star in marketing strategy, a title that had never existed before, and seemed designed to create the impression that Dylan was already contributing at a senior level. Then there was the December incident with the Colorado Springs Bank proposal. I had spent weeks developing a comprehensive rebranding strategy for their merger announcement, working closely with their executive team to understand their messaging priorities and market positioning needs. The night before the final presentation, Dylan had asked to review the materials to provide a fresh perspective. The next morning, during the presentation to the bank's board of directors, Dylan had presented several modifications to my strategy as if they were collaborative improvements, rather than last-minute additions. The changes weren't necessarily bad, but they demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the bank's survive corporate culture and risk tolerance. I had to diplomatically steer the conversation back to the original strategy, while making it appear that Dylan's suggestions had been valuable input. After the meeting, the bank's CEO had pulled me aside and quietly asked if there were any concerns about leadership transitions at Henderson. His question had seemed strange at the time, but now I understood that he was picking up on the same tension I was beginning to feel. The Christmas party had been another telling moment. Bob Henderson had given his annual toast to the company's success, and for the first time in years, he had spent more time talking about the future than celebrating the past. He spoke about evolving leadership, generational transitions, and preparing for tomorrow's challenges with tomorrow's leaders. During that same party, I had noticed Dylan circulating among our clients with a confidence that seemed disproportionate to his actual involvement in their account. He spoke about his vision for their upcoming campaigns, and his ideas for improving their market positioning. Several clients had looked confused by his assertions, clearly understanding that their relationships were with me, not with Bob's son. The January team retreat had been the most obvious sign that something was shifting. For 5 years I had planned and facilitated our annual strategic planning session, working with each team member to set goals, identify opportunities, and align our departmental objectives with company priorities. This year, Bob had announced that Dylan would be co-facilitating the retreat to bring fresh educational perspectives to our planning process. During the retreat, Dylan had presented a PowerPoint about disruptive marketing strategies and leveraging synergistic opportunities for maximum impact. The presentation was filled with business school buzzwords and theoretical frameworks that had little connection to our actual client needs or market realities. When team members asked specific questions about implementation, Dylan had deferred to me for execution detail. What bothered me most about the retreat wasn't Dylan's inexperience, but the way Bob had positioned his contributions as strategic leadership, while characterizing my 12 years of proven results as operational support. It was a subtle but significant shift in perception that made Dylan appear to be the visionary while I was relegated to the role of tactical implementer. February had brought the most concerning development: changes in client communication protocol. Bob had announced that all major client communications should be copied to Dylan for strategic oversight and continuity plan. On the surface, this seemed like a reasonable training approach, but it effectively gave Dylan access to every client relationship, every strategic discussion, and every confidential business conversation. I had started noticing Dylan forwarding these emails to his personal account, ostensibly for off-site review, but creating a comprehensive record of all our client intelligence and strategic thinking. When I mentioned this to Bob as a potential security concern, he had dismissed it as necessary for Dylan's professional development. The most troubling incident had occurred just 3 weeks ago during a strategy session with Tech Forward Solutions. Maria Gonzalez had specifically requested a closed-door meeting to discuss sensitive competitive intelligence about their upcoming product launch. The meeting was scheduled for our most secure conference room, with strict confidentiality protocols in place. Halfway through the meeting, Dylan had knocked on the door and asked to join the discussion to observe strategic planning processes for learning purposes. Maria had looked uncomfortable but agreed to his presence after Bob personally vouched for his discretion. During the meeting, Dylan had taken extensive notes and asked detailed questions about Tech Forward's proprietary market research and competitive analysis. 2 days later, I had learned through industry contacts that similar strategic insights had somehow reached Morrison Creative Group, Henderson & Co.'s biggest competitor. The leak hadn't been traced back to anyone specific, but the timing was suspicious, and the information was too detailed to have come from public sources. When I had raised my concerns with Bob, he had accused me of being paranoid and overly protective of information that should be shared within the company for strategic purposes. He suggested that my reluctance to include Dylan in confidential discussions reflected a territorial mindset that wasn't aligned with the company's collaborative culture. Territorial mindset. The phrase had stung because it implied that my careful protection of client confidentiality was somehow selfish rather than professional. It was another subtle redefinition of my behavior, casting prudent caution as problematic possessiveness. Now, sitting in my apartment with the clarity that comes from distance and reflection, I could see the entire manipulation for what it was. Dylan's gradual insertion into my role hadn't been random or opportunistic, it had been systematic and strategic. Every change, every meeting, every protocol modification had been designed to position him as the natural successor while simultaneously undermining my authority and credibility. The genius of the approach was its subtlety. None of the individual changes had been dramatic enough to trigger immediate concern, but their cumulative effect had been to completely reshape the power dynamics within the marketing department. By the time I realized what was happening, Dylan had already established himself as a key player in client relationships and strategic decisions. But there was something else I was beginning to understand, something that went beyond simple nepotism or family favoritism. The pattern of changes, the systematic nature of the transition, and the sophisticated manipulation of client relationships suggested a level of strategic thinking that Dylan simply didn't possess. Someone else had been orchestrating this transition, someone with experience in corporate politics and a deep understanding of how to execute a gradual leadership change without triggering alarm bells. Dylan might have been the beneficiary, but he wasn't the architect. My phone rang, interrupting my analysis. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. Sarah Mitchell speaking. Miss Mitchell, this is Tom Bradley from the Denver Business Journal. I'm following up on the story about management changes at Henderson & Co. I was wondering if you'd be available for a brief interview about your perspective on the transition. The Denver Business Journal. The story was gaining traction in the local business community, and now reporters were seeking direct comments from the people involved. This was exactly the kind of media attention that Bob Henderson had been trying to avoid. Mr. Bradley, I appreciate your interest, but I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment on internal company decisions. I understand your position, Mitchell, but several industry sources have described the change as unusual, particularly given your track record and the timing. Some are suggesting that it represents a shift away from merit-based promotion toward family favoritism. Merit-based promotion versus family favoritism. The reporter was clearly framing the story in terms that would resonate with business readers who valued professional competence over personal connections. I'm sorry, but I really can't provide any comments for publication, I said. You might want to contact Henderson & Public Relations Department for their official position. After ending the call, I realized that my refusal to comment was probably more damaging to Henderson and Co. than any statement I could have made. Experienced business reporters understood that when key players declined to defend controversial decisions, it usually meant those decisions were indefensible. My laptop chimed with a new email notification. The message was from David Park, my former team member. "Sarah, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to let you know that 3 more people submitted resignations yesterday, including Jennifer from the creative team and Mark from account services. The department is falling apart, and Dylan is completely overwhelmed." He spent 2 hours in a conference room yesterday with Bob and some consultant, apparently trying to figure out how to handle the client situation. Word is that they're considering bringing in interim management to stabilize things. "Thought you should know. Take care, David." Interim manager. That was corporate speak for admitting that Dylan wasn't capable of handling the position he had been given. Bob Henderson was apparently beginning to realize that good intentions and family loyalty weren't sufficient qualifications for senior leadership role. But there was something in David's email that caught my attention. Some consultant. Who was Bob working with to address the crisis? And why was this the first I was hearing about outside advisors being brought in to manage the situation? I called Jen Carter, knowing that she would have insight into what was happening at the senior management level. "Sarah," she answered enthusiastically, "I'm so glad you called. This place is complete chaos." David mentioned that Bob is working with a consultant. "Do you know who it is?" "Yeah, it's some guy named Marcus Webb from Webb Strategic Consulting. He specializes in crisis management and organizational transitions. He's been here for 2 days, interviewing everyone and reviewing all our client relationships." Marcus Webb. I knew that name from industry publications and conference presentations. He was known for his expertise in helping companies recover from leadership failures and management crises. His involvement suggested that Bob was taking the situation much more seriously than his public statements indicated. "What kinds of questions is he asking?" "Everything," Jen said. "Client history, team dynamics, project management processes, campaign performance metrics. He's also asking a lot of questions about you specifically. Not negative stuff, but like trying to understand your role in building the department and maintaining client relationships. Questions about me." That was interesting. A crisis management consultant wouldn't be focusing on a former employee unless he believed my departure was central to understanding and solving the current problems. "Jen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Had you noticed any changes in how Bob and Dylan were interacting with clients before this week?" There was a long pause. "Actually, yes. It started around Christmas. Dylan began sitting in on client calls that he had never been involved with before, and Bob started including him in strategic discussions that used to be just you and the senior team." Did it seem like they were planning something specific, or was it more gradual? Looking back, it definitely seemed planned. Like they were systematically introducing Dylan to all your key relationships and responsibilities. At the time, I thought it was just professional development. But now it feels like they were preparing for this transition for months. Months of preparation. That confirmed my growing suspicion that this wasn't an impulsive decision triggered by immediate circumstances. Bob and Dylan had been planning this transition systematically, which meant they had also been planning my departure for much longer than I had realized. But if they had been planning this for months, why had they been so unprepared for the client reactions and team resistance? Why hadn't they anticipated the negative publicity and industry backlash? The answer, I realized, lay in their fundamental misunderstanding of what made the marketing department successful. Bob and Dylan had focused on the technical aspects of the transition, introducing Dylan to clients, familiarizing him with accounts, teaching him about campaign strategies, but they had completely overlooked the relationship dynamics that actually drove client loyalty and team performance. They had assumed that professional relationships were transactional, that clients would accept Dylan as my replacement, simply because he had been introduced to them and briefed on their needs. They had failed to understand that trust, credibility, and expertise couldn't be transferred through meetings and PowerPoint presentations. Similarly, they had assumed that the marketing team would accept Dylan's leadership because of his MBA credentials and his father's authority. They hadn't considered that seasoned professionals might be unwilling to work for someone with no real-world experience, regardless of his educational background or family connection. My phone buzzed with another text message, this one from Maria Gonzalez. "Sarah, I just got a call from Marcus Webb asking about our decision to leave Henderson & Co. Apparently Bob Henderson hired him to investigate the client defection. I told him the truth, that we have no confidence in Dylan's ability to manage our account. Hope that's helpful for whatever you're planning next." Whatever I was planning next. Maria's phrasing suggested that she expected me to be developing some kind of strategic response to the situation, rather than simply moving on to new opportunities. It was an interesting assumption, and it made me wonder what other people in the industry were expecting from me. The truth was, I hadn't been planning anything beyond focusing on my immediate opportunities and building my consulting practice. But Maria's message, combined with the pattern of industry interest and support I had been receiving, suggested that my next moves might have broader implications than I had initially considered. I opened my laptop and began researching Marcus Webb and his consulting practice. His website described his approach as comprehensive organizational assessment and strategic realignment, which typically meant he would spend several weeks analyzing every aspect of Henderson & Co. operations before recommending solutions. But what caught my attention was a case study on his website about a previous client situation that sounded remarkably similar to Henderson & Co.'s current crisis. A family-owned business had promoted the founder's son to a senior position, triggering client defections and employee departure. Webb's solution had been to restructure the organization with the son in a more appropriate role, while bringing in experienced external leadership to manage client relationship. If Bob Henderson was serious about saving his company, he might be willing to swallow his pride and admit that Dylan needed more preparation before taking on senior responsibility. That could create an opportunity for someone with proven experience in client relationship management and team leadership. Someone exactly like me. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Bob Henderson might end up paying a crisis management consultant to recommend that he hire back the person he had just forced out, possibly at a higher salary and with greater autonomy than I had ever had before. But there was something else I was beginning to understand about the situation, something that went beyond the immediate crisis at Henderson & Co. The industry reaction to my departure, the opportunities that were emerging, and the level of support I was receiving all suggested that my professional reputation was actually stronger than I had realized. For 12 years I had been so focused on proving myself at Henderson & Co. that I had never really tested my value in the broader market. I had built my career around one company, one set of relationships, and one definition of success. Now, for the first time, I was seeing myself through the eyes of the entire industry, and the reflection was remarkably positive. The question wasn't whether I could rebuild my career after leaving Henderson & Co. The question was whether I wanted to limit myself to rebuilding what I had before, or whether I was ready to create something entirely new and potentially much more significant. As I sat in my apartment, surrounded by the remnants of my old professional life and contemplating the possibilities of a new one, I realized that Bob Henderson had actually done me an enormous favor. By forcing me out of my comfortable position, he had pushed me to discover opportunities and capabilities I never would have explored otherwise. The pattern was becoming clear, but it wasn't the pattern I had initially thought I was seeing. This wasn't just about Dylan's systematic preparation to take over my role, it was about my systematic preparation, over 12 years of building relationships and demonstrating expertise, to take on something much bigger than a senior marketing director position at a single agent. The real question was what I was going to do with that preparation. 3 weeks after leaving Henderson & Co., I was sitting in the penthouse conference room of Tech Forward Solutions, watching Maria Gonzalez present our preliminary campaign results to her board of directors. The numbers on the screen told a story that even I hadn't fully anticipated. Brand recognition up 37%, website traffic increased by 62%, and lead generation exceeding targets by 45%.
all in just 3 weeks. The consulting arrangement with Tech Forward had evolved into something much more substantial than either Maria or I had initially envisioned. What started as a simple project to replace Henderson and Co. Services had become a comprehensive rebranding initiative that was transforming how Tech Forward positioned itself in the competitive Denver tech market. But more importantly, it had become a showcase for what was possible when marketing strategy was driven by genuine expertise, rather than family connections or corporate politics. Every presentation, every campaign element, and every strategic decision was being scrutinized by industry observers who were watching to see if my departure from Henderson and Co. had been their loss or my liberation. The answer was becoming increasingly clear. Sarah's approach has been completely different from what we experienced with traditional agencies, Maria was explaining to her board. Instead of trying to fit our needs into their existing frameworks, she's developed customized strategies that address our specific market challenges and growth objectives. I watched the faces around the conference table as Maria continued her presentation. These were seasoned executives who had built Tech Forward from a startup into a major regional player, and they understood the difference between marketing fluff and substantive strategy. Their expressions showed genuine interest and approval, the kind of engagement that came from seeing real results, rather than just creative presentations. After the meeting, Maria walked me to the elevator with a proposal that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. Sarah, the board was incredibly impressed with what you've accomplished in such a short time. We'd like to discuss expanding our relationship beyond the current consulting arrangement. What did you have in mind? We're considering creating a chief marketing officer position, someone who would work exclusively with Tech Forward to develop and execute our long-term marketing strategy. The role would come with equity participation, significant autonomy, and the resources to build whatever kind of team you think we need. Chief Marketing Officer, equity participation. The offer represented everything I had been working toward at Henderson and Co., but had never been able to achieve within the constraints of an agency structure. It would mean joining Tech Forward's executive team, having a direct voice in company strategy, and building a marketing organization from the ground up. That's an incredibly generous offer, Marie. I'd definitely like to discuss it further. There's one more thing, she said as the elevator arrived. We're planning to announce our Series C funding round next month, and we want our new marketing leadership to be part of that announcement. It would be a very public statement about our commitment to strategic growth and professional excellence. Very public statement. In the tight-knit Denver business community, Tech Forward's announcement would be seen as a direct commentary on the quality of talent that Henderson and Co. had lost. It would also position me as a senior executive rather than just a displaced agency employee, fundamentally changing how the industry viewed my departure and future prospects. As I drove back to my apartment, I reflected on how dramatically my situation had changed in just 3 weeks.
The consulting work with Tech Forward was generating more revenue than my Henderson and Co. salary had provided, and the CMO offer would represent a significant step up in both compensation and responsibility. But beyond the financial benefits, I was rediscovering the excitement of building something new rather than just maintaining something that already existed. My phone rang as I pulled into my parking garage. The caller ID showed a number I had been expecting. Marcus Webb, the crisis consultant working with Henderson and Co. Miss Mitchell, this is Marcus Webb, from Webb Strategic Consulting. I'm working with Bob Henderson on some organizational challenges at Henderson and Co., and I was wondering if you might be available for a brief conversation. Of course, Mr. Webb. When would work for you? Actually, I'm in your neighborhood right now. Would you be available for coffee this afternoon? I promise it won't take long. An hour later, I was sitting across from Marcus Webb in a quiet corner of my favorite coffee shop, studying the man who had been brought in to clean up the mess that my departure had created. Webb was in his 50s, with graying temples and the kind of calm confidence that came from managing corporate crises for decades. His approach was direct but respectful, the manner of someone who understood that he was dealing with a key stakeholder, rather than a problem to be solved. Miss Mitchell, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. As you probably know, Henderson and Co. is experiencing some significant challenges related to client retention and team stability. I've heard there have been some difficulties with the transition. Webb smiled slightly. That's one way to put it. In my experience, when a company loses 30% of its revenue and 40% of its senior staff in 3 weeks, we're dealing with more than transition difficulties. 30% of revenue, 40% of senior staff. The numbers were even worse than I had realized. Henderson and Co. wasn't just experiencing client defections. It was facing an existential crisis that threatened the survival of the entire company. Mr. Webb, I'm not sure how I can help with Henderson and Co.'s current situation. I'm no longer affiliated with the company. Actually, that's exactly why your perspective is valuable. I've been interviewing current employees, reviewing client feedback, and analyzing the company's operational challenges. But I need to understand what Henderson and Co. has lost in order to recommend how they might recover. What they had lost. Webb was approaching the situation with the kind of systematic analysis that Bob Henderson should have conducted before making his decision to promote Dylan. The irony wasn't lost on me that Henderson and Co. was now paying a consultant to quantify the value of the employee they had forced out. What specific information are you looking for? I'd like to understand your role in building and maintaining the client relationships that have been lost. I've reviewed the account histories, but I need to understand the personal and professional factors that created such strong client loyalty. For the next hour, I walked Webb through the development of each major client relationship, explaining the strategic challenges each company had faced and how I had helped them address those challenges. I described the trust-building process that took months or even years to establish, the way client needs evolved over time, and the importance of consistent performance in maintaining long-term partnership. Webb took detailed notes, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his understanding of complex business relationships. It was clear that he grasped the difference between transactional service delivery and strategic partnership, something that Bob Henderson had apparently never fully appreciated. Mitchell, based on what you've described, it seems like these weren't just client relationships, but genuine business partnerships built on mutual trust and demonstrated results. Exactly. My clients weren't just buying marketing services, they were investing in strategic guidance and creative problem solving. Those relationships can't be transferred to someone else, simply through introductions and account briefings. Webb nodded thoughtfully. That helps explain why Dylan Henderson has been unable to maintain these relationships despite his educational credentials and family connections. Dylan isn't necessarily incompetent, I said carefully. He just doesn't have the experience or track record that these clients expect from their strategic partners. They're paying for expertise that takes years to develop. Which brings me to my next question, Webb said, leaning forward slightly. If Henderson and Co. were to restructure its leadership and create an environment that addressed the concerns that led to your departure, would you consider returning to the company? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Webb was essentially asking if I would be willing to come back and clean up the mess that Bob Henderson had created. Probably at a significantly higher salary and with greater autonomy than I had ever had before. 6 months ago, the offer would have been irresistible. The chance to return to Henderson and Co. as a senior executive, to rebuild the department I had created, and to prove that the company's success had been built on my contributions, rather than Bob's leadership, would have felt like the ultimate vindication. But now, sitting in a coffee shop 3 weeks into a new chapter of my career, the idea of going backward felt almost absurd. Why would I return to a company that had demonstrated such poor judgment, work for a leader who had valued family politics over professional competence, and rebuild something that I was already surpassing in my independent practice? Ms. Webb, I appreciate the hypothetical question, but I'm not sure it's relevant to your current situation. Henderson and Co. needs to find solutions that work within their existing structure and relationships, not strategies that depend on undoing decisions they've already made. Webb studied me for a moment, and I could see him processing my diplomatic refusal. He was experienced enough to understand that my lack of interest in returning wasn't about money or titles, it was about fundamental differences in vision and values. I understand, he said finally, but I hope you'll consider one more question. If you were advising Henderson and Co. on how to rebuild their client relationships and team stability, What would you recommend? It was a generous question, one that allowed me to provide helpful guidance without compromising my own interests or appearing vindictive toward my former employer. I spent several minutes outlining the steps Henderson and would need to take, acknowledging their mistakes publicly, restructuring Dylan's role to match his actual capabilities, investing in experienced senior talent, and committing to a long-term rebuilding process that prioritized client needs over family dynamic. After Webb left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, processing our conversation and its implications. The fact that Henderson and Co. had hired a crisis consultant confirmed what industry observers had been speculating. The company was in serious trouble and would need dramatic changes to survive. But more importantly, Webb's questions had forced me to articulate something I had been sensing, but hadn't fully acknowledged. I had outgrown Henderson and Co. even before Bob Henderson forced me out. The constraints of agency life, the limitations of working for someone else's vision, and the frustrations of corporate politics had been holding me back from pursuing bigger opportunities and more ambitious goals. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Williams, the executive recruiter. "Sarah, I have 3 CEO-level opportunities that would be perfect for your skill set. All involve building marketing organizations from scratch for high-growth companies. Are you ready to think bigger than agency work?" Think bigger than agency work. The phrase perfectly captured what I had been feeling but hadn't been able to express. For 12 years, I had been thinking in terms of departments, accounts, and campaigns. Now I was beginning to think in terms of companies, markets, and transformation. That evening, I called my mentor, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a marketing professor at the University of Denver, who had guided my career decisions for the past decade. Elizabeth had built and sold 2 successful consulting firms before transitioning to academia, and her perspective on business strategy had always been invaluable. "Sarah, I've been following your situation with great interest," she said after I updated her on recent developments. "From an outside perspective, it looks like Bob Henderson just gave you the push you needed to stop playing it safe and start pursuing your real potential." "What do you mean?" "You've been extraordinarily successful at Henderson and Co., but you've also been comfortable. You built an excellent career within someone else's framework, but you never tested what you could accomplish with complete creative and strategic freedom." Elizabeth's observation was both flattering and challenging. She was suggesting that my success at Henderson and Co. had actually been limiting my growth by providing too much security and structure. "The opportunities you're describing with Tech Forward and these other companies represent something completely different," she continued. "Instead of executing other people's visions, you'd be creating and implementing your own strategic vision. Instead of managing within constraints, you'd be defining the constraints. It's a fundamentally different level of responsibility and impact, but it's also much riskier. At Henderson and Co., I had the security of an established company, proven processes, and predictable income." "True," Elizabeth said, "but you also had the limitations of agency life, serving multiple masters, competing for resources, and building other people's businesses instead of your own. The question is whether you're ready to trade security for significance." Security for significance. The phrase resonated deeply because it captured the choice I was really facing. I could pursue safe opportunities that replicated what I had done before, or I could embrace uncertainty in pursuit of something much more meaningful and impactful. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking constantly about Elizabeth's challenge. The Tech Forward CMO offer was compelling not just because of the compensation and equity, but because it represented a chance to build something from the ground up. The executive recruiting opportunities Patricia Williams had mentioned were intriguing because they would involve creating entire marketing organizations for high-growth companies. But there was another possibility I hadn't seriously considered: starting my own company. The consulting work I had been doing was generating strong results and positive industry attention. Several former Henderson and Co. clients had expressed interest in working with me independently. Other companies were reaching out through referrals and industry connections. The foundation for an independent practice was already in place. The question was whether I was ready to make the leap from employee to entrepreneur, from following someone else's vision to creating my own. My laptop chimed with an email from James Morrison at Morrison Creative Group. Sarah, I know you've been exploring various opportunities, but I wanted to make one more pitch for joining our team. We're prepared to offer you a partnership track position with significant equity participation and full autonomy over client strategy. It would combine the security of an established firm with the creative freedom of independent practice. Partnership track at Morrison Creative Group would be an excellent career move by any traditional measure. The company was successful, growing rapidly, and offered the kind of compensation and advancement opportunities that most marketing professionals could only dream about. James Morrison was respected in the industry, and working with him would provide access to resources and relationships that would take years to build independently. But as I read his email, I realized that even this generous offer felt limiting compared to the possibilities I was beginning to envision. Morrison Creative Group was still someone else's company, built on someone else's vision and constrained by someone else's priority. I opened a new document on my laptop and began writing what would become the business plan for Mitchell Strategic Marketing, an independent consultancy focused on helping high-growth companies develop and execute transformational marketing strategies. As I wrote, I felt an excitement and clarity that I hadn't experienced in years. The plan outlined a different kind of marketing firm, one that would work with a smaller number of clients on more substantial, longer-term projects. Instead of managing multiple accounts with competing priorities, I would focus on becoming a true strategic partner with companies that were ready to make significant investments in their marketing capabilities. The financial projections were conservative but promising. Based on the consulting rates I was already commanding and the level of interest I was receiving from potential clients, Mitchell Strategic Marketing could be profitable within 6 months and generating 7-figure revenue within 2 years. But more importantly, it would be built on my vision of what marketing consulting should be: strategic rather than tactical, relationship-based rather than transactional, and focused on long-term transformation rather than short-term campaign. 3 days later, I was back in Tech Forward's conference room, this time presenting Maria Gonzalez with a counter-offer to her CMO proposal. Maria, I'm incredibly honored by your offer, and Tech Forward would be an amazing company to work for. But I'd like to propose an alternative arrangement that I think could be even more beneficial for both of us. I outlined the concept for Mitchell Strategic Marketing and proposed that Tech Forward become my founding client rather than my employee. The arrangement would provide them with the same strategic leadership and dedicated attention as the CMO position, but with the flexibility of a consulting relationship that could evolve as their needs changed. It's an interesting proposition, Maria said after I finished my presentation. But why would you choose the uncertainty of starting your own firm over the security of joining our executive team? Because I think both of us would benefit more from a true partnership than from an employment relationship. As your CMO, I'd be constrained by internal politics, budget limitations, and corporate processes. As your strategic partner, I can focus exclusively on delivering results and building your marketing capabilities. Maria was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of my proposal. Finally, she smiled. Sarah, 6 months ago, if you had presented this idea, I would have thought you were crazy to turn down a senior executive position. But watching how you've handled your transition from Henderson and seeing the results you've delivered in just 3 weeks, I think you might be exactly the kind of entrepreneur we want to partner with. Does that mean you're interested in the arrangement? It means I want to discuss it with the board and see if we can structure something that gives us the strategic guidance we need, while supporting your vision for independent practice. That evening, I celebrated with a bottle of wine and a view of the Denver skyline from my apartment balcony. 6 weeks earlier, I had been a successful but constrained senior marketing director at Henderson & Co. Now I was on the verge of launching my own firm with Tech Forward as a founding client, and several other major opportunities in development. Bob Henderson had intended to replace me with his inexperienced son, but he had actually freed me to pursue ambitions I hadn't even realized I had. Dylan's appointment had forced me out of my comfort zone and into a world of possibilities that would never have been available within the constraints of agency employment. My phone rang one final time that day. The caller ID showed Bob Henderson's direct line, a number I hadn't seen in weeks. Sarah, this is Bob. I hope you're doing well. Hello, Bob. I'm doing very well, thank you. Sarah, I'm calling because I've been working with a consultant to address some of the challenges we've been facing since your departure. I realize now that we may have made some mistakes in how we handled the transition. Mistakes, after 6 weeks of crisis management and client defections. Bob Henderson was finally ready to acknowledge that promoting Dylan had been an error in judgment. I appreciate you sharing that. The truth is, we underestimated your value to the company and overestimated Dylan's readiness for senior leadership. We'd like to discuss the possibility of you returning to Henderson & Co. in a more senior role with significantly enhanced compensation and autonomy. For a moment I felt a surge of satisfaction. The vindication was complete. Bob Henderson was admitting his mistake and asking me to return on better terms than I had ever enjoyed before. But the satisfaction faded quickly, replaced by something much more powerful: confidence in the path I had chosen. Bob, I'm grateful for the offer, but I'm not interested in returning to Henderson & Co. I'm launching my own consulting firm, and I'm excited about building something new, rather than rebuilding something that's already been damaged. There was a long pause. Sarah, I understand that you're upset about how things ended, but I hope you'll consider the security and resources that Henderson & Co. can provide. Starting your own firm is risky, especially in a competitive market like Denver. You're right that it's risky, but it's also the right decision for where I am in my career. I've learned that sometimes the biggest risk is playing it safe. After ending the call with Bob, I poured another glass of wine and returned to my balcony. The city lights stretched out below me, each one representing a business, a dream, or an ambition that someone had decided to pursue despite uncertainty and risky. Tomorrow I would begin the process of officially launching Mitchell's strategic marketing. I would finalize the partnership agreement with Tech Forward, respond to the executive recruiting opportunities that Patricia Williams had presented, and start building the team that would help me execute the vision I had been developing. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be safe, but for the first time in my career, it would be entirely mine. Bob Henderson had thought he was making a simple family decision when he promoted Dylan to replace me. What he had actually done was catalyze a transformation that would ultimately benefit everyone except Henderson, and Tech Forward would get strategic marketing leadership from someone who was fully invested in their success. The Denver marketing community would gain a new firm built on merit and performance rather than politics and connection. And I would finally discover what I was capable of achieving when freed from the constraints of someone else's limited vision. 6 weeks ago, losing my job had felt like the end of something important. Now I understood that it had actually been the beginning of something extraordinary. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.